Good morning, everybody. We are a little bit behind schedule, but don't worry, Miss Candidate, you will get the extra time which we add to the whole event. Hereby, I open officially this academic ceremony in which Miss Kathleen Bakker will defend her academic thesis entitled The Presentation, Use and Identification of Retracted Publications in the Health Sciences. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusion of your thesis in the next 15 minutes, and I'm pleased to give you the word, Miss Candidate.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
So good morning, esteemed and highly esteemed opponents, esteemed promoters, and members of the audience. Thank you for being here today. I appreciate your time and the opportunity to present this work entitled The Presentation, Use, and Identification of Retracted Publications in the Health Sciences. Scientific progress is not linear. Ideas need to be tested and retested again. And sometimes the things that are believed to be true are found not to be, and science must be corrected. Now, there are almost 3 million new scholarly articles every year. Given that volume, it is inevitable that in the conduct of that research, the creation of those publications, there will be some mistakes, there will be some errors, there may be some lapses in judgment, and yes, even some bad actors. And as such, there need to be mechanisms to address these issues. Now, retraction is one such mechanism. So retraction is an official statement from an editor or a publisher that alerts readers to articles that contain such seriously flawed or erroneous content or data that their findings and conclusions cannot be relied upon. Other reasons for retraction might include plagiarism, peer review manipulation, unethical research, or failure to disclose competing interests, amongst others. Now, retraction is a means to an end. It's a mechanism that's meant to correct the scholarly record. But to say that the scholarly record has been corrected implies that there is a shared recognition and understanding that a correction has occurred. In other words, an effectively functioning retraction process must correct in such a way that is broadly understandable. And it's this functioning and understanding that this thesis explores. So more specifically, this thesis aimed to determine the consistency and clarity of the retracted status of publications, to investigate the continued citation of retracted publications and factors associated with that citation, and to validate strategies for the identification of retracted publications and propose recommendations to help minimize inappropriate use of retracted publications. So to address our first aim, we focused on the field of public health. So we analyzed 441 retracted publications in the field of public health, which were identified using the Retraction Watch database. We searched for each retracted publication in 11 different platforms that are commonly used by public health researchers to find scholarly information. And we found over 2,800 records for these publications in these different resources. We then assessed how consistently retracted publications were flagged as retracted and how clear and complete their retraction notices were. And we assessed this based on criteria from the Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE, the International Council of Medical Journal Editors, or ICMJE, the National Library of Medicine, or NLM, and Retraction Watch. Now, of the over 2,800 records that we found, slightly less than 50% showed that the publication had been retracted. And the experience could vary quite a bit across platforms. Some would flag as few as 12%, and others would flag as many as 90% of the retracted publications as retracted, as you can see in this chart. Now, when we look at how frequently a single publication is marked as retracted across platforms, we found that about 5% of the publications were flagged as retracted in every platform through which they were available, while slightly less than 8% were never flagged retracted in any platform. We were able to access 414 retraction notices for these retracted publications, and none of the notices met all of the criteria. Notices were often vague and they lacked essential details. For example, while almost 97% identified the retracted publication, only about 1% of the notices said whether the journal was going to be sanctioning the authors. In addition, only about 60% of the notices were linked to the retracted publication, and less than 20% of the notices indicated what parts of the publication were problematic. So this project revealed substantial inconsistencies in how retracted public health publications were flagged, and it found that retraction notices often didn't contain sufficient detail. And these inconsistencies and this vagueness can pose a real challenge to researchers, to clinicians, and to policymakers who are trying to make evidence-based decisions. So to address our second aim and learn more about the potential ongoing use of retracted publications, we examined the citation of retracted publications in two health sciences fields, dentistry and pharmacy. To explore the ongoing citation of retracted publications in dentistry, we found 136 dentistry publications in the Retraction Watch database, and we mapped the reasons for retraction provided by Retraction Watch to a taxonomy from researchers Bakker and Halevi. Reasons for retraction were coded as scientific distortion, which would include fabrication, falsification, as well as honest errors, ethical misconduct in cases such as plagiarism or failure to obtain ethics board approval, and administrative error, as would be the case with a journal that had erroneously published the wrong version of an article, for example. And Bakker and Halevi posited that scientific distortion was the most severe of the reasons, followed by ethical misconduct and finally administrative errors. We then conducted searches in both Scopus and Web of Science to identify citations to those retracted publications. And we were looking exclusively at citations that happened after the publication had been retracted. We assessed the nature of each citation using another taxonomy that was developed by, again, Bakker and Halevi, where we coded each citation as being either posited, in which the retracted article was treated as valid, neutral, in which the retracted article was mentioned, but no judgment was offered and it wasn't really engaged with too substantially, or it could be coded as negative, in which the retraction was explicitly acknowledged and there was critique of the paper. So of the 136 retracted publications, 84 were cited at least once after their retraction. Now, the reason for a publication's retraction wasn't found to be connected to whether it was cited after retraction. And we found that most citations, approximately 69%, were positive, while 25% were neutral, and only about 5% were negative. We then shifted our focus to a different field and a specific publication type, investigating the use of retracted publications in evidence syntheses in the field of pharmacy. Drawing again on the Retraction Watch database, we found almost 1,400 retracted publications in the pharmaceutical sciences. We again used Scopus and Web of Science to find those publications that cited the retracted publications. After removing duplicates, we had about 32,000 citing publications, which we then screened to find only the evidence syntheses. Now, an evidence synthesis is a type of study that involves the systematic identification and selection of all available evidence on a topic and the subsequent extraction, appraisal, and summation of that evidence to have a comprehensive, unbiased understanding of the topic. Now, evidence syntheses are incredibly valuable because they let us make sense of large bodies of information using, as the Canadian Institute of Health Research notes, reproducible and transparent methods, which in turn allows for decisions to be made based on the best available evidence. And while, of course, this is really important when we think about future research, it's also critically important when we think about practical applications like patient care. And as echoed by the Royal Society and the Academy of Medical Sciences, it's also very important to policymakers and to society overall. So in this study, looking at evidence syntheses that cite retracted publications, we found that 283 retracted publications had been cited 1,096 times in evidence syntheses, and approximately 1/3 of these citations happened after the retraction. We were also interested in learning more about these citations and about these evidence syntheses. Like with the dentistry project, we assessed the nature of the citation, classifying it as positive, neutral, or negative, and we assessed the methodological quality of the evidence synthesis using AmStar2, which is a checklist designed to assess strengths and weaknesses of syntheses. And that can generate 4 possible outcomes where you have a high quality, moderate quality, low quality, or critically low quality synthesis. So of the evidence syntheses that cited retracted publications in our sample, approximately 70% were found to be of critically low quality. Most of the citations, about 43%, were positive, while 36% were neutral and slightly over 20% were negative. We found that high quality reviews tended to have negative citations to retracted publications, while critically low quality reviews tended to have positive citations to retracted publications. Cumulatively, through these projects, we found that retracted publications continue to be cited after they've been retracted. Perhaps more importantly, these citations are most frequently positive, followed by neutral. In the case of evidence syntheses, we found that most evidence syntheses that cite retracted publications do so positively and were of critically low quality. Given that evidence syntheses are often considered a key information source in evidence-based practice and decision-making, the inappropriate inclusion of retracted publications in these reviews is troubling. So this leads to our third objective, because after discussing the challenges and the potential problems stemming from retracted publications, we also wanted to offer some potential solutions and some strategies to mitigate impact. So we want to validate some existing approaches to identifying retracted publications in the evidence synthesis process. To do this, we identified over 43,500 retracted publications and over 27,700 of their retraction notices using the Retraction Watch database. We then looked at 8 different platforms, which were identified with the help of our advisory committee of researchers and librarians. And we looked at how many of these items could possibly be found in each platform. And then we tested 5 different approaches to see how many of the available items could be found in each platform using each approach. So for the approaches, we had 2 different search strategies. We used database-specific indexing, and we tested 2 citation managers and Note and Zotero. So focusing in on how many of the retracted publications the different approaches were able to flag and what was missed, we did find that Zotero caught nearly all of the retracted publications, while EndNote varied a little bit more, and it wasn't as reliable across all databases. The search strategies didn't perform quite as well, while database indexing tended to miss the most publications. However, as you can see in this table, there was quite a bit of variation when we look at how many retracted publications would be missed using each approach. Depending on the platform and the approach used, you might either catch all of the retracted publications, or you could miss almost all of the retracted publications. But the biggest takeaway here is that no one approach catches everything. It varies across platforms, and it will also vary over time as platforms are changed and updated and as tools evolve. So while there are several systemic issues that pose challenges, including opaque retraction notices, inconsistent indexing, and a lack of standardization amongst publishers and platforms, there are also actions that can be taken by different parties to help address these challenges. Authors of evidence syntheses should use one or more of the identification approaches previously outlined, and should include an information professional or a librarian on the review team, not only to ensure a high-quality search, but also to ensure appropriate implementation of one of those aforementioned approaches. Authors should also incorporate appropriate statistical tests and methodological techniques to effectively identify problematic or biased studies, and then to assess the impact of those studies. Editors and publishers of evidence syntheses can leverage existing and emerging technologies to check for retractions during the final proofing stage. They can also ensure that peer reviewers have the necessary tools to evaluate the methodological quality of the review, and that peer reviewers have sufficiently diverse and robust expertise to thoroughly assess the manuscript. For editors and publishers who are issuing retractions, providing robust retraction notices and ensuring that metadata is updated across all systems is crucial for evidence syntheses, but it's also crucial for all readers, all researchers, policymakers, practitioners, really anyone who wants to access scholarly material. Those who are helping to provide access to those materials, namely database developers and vendors, can work to improve indexing and flagging mechanisms and ensure that retraction information is visible and up to date. And finally, for institutions and funders, providing training on identifying and handling retracted publications, enforcing best practices for conducting and updating systematic reviews, and providing the institutional and methodological supports necessary to align with best practices can incentivize researchers and equip them with the necessary knowledge to undertake this work. So retraction is not yet functioning as expected. However, there are multiple opportunities to improve the system, and it is the collective responsibility of researchers, librarians, editors, publishers, institutions, and funders to ensure that these opportunities are realized. In the words of Michael Inslick, science is self-correcting, we are told, but it can only be self-correcting if we transcend our human need to defend and instead acknowledge that there is something to correct. Reducing the stigma associated with retractions, including incentivizing and rewarding self-correction, can help to foster a culture of transparency and integrity. Rather than treating retractions as failures or as punishments, something to be avoided or done as quietly as possible, they should instead be seen as essential mechanisms for scientific progress and indicative of a commitment to scientific ideals. And with that, I will thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation, well documented, a lot of information, but we do have 45 minutes to discuss this. And I would like to, and as you already know, we have 4 members in the opposition, and I would like to start with the opposition with giving Professor Evenel from the University of Aberdeen, affiliated as Clinical Chair in Health Services Research, the opportunity to start a discussion with you. And I would also like to thank her that she joins us all the way from Scotland. Thank you very much, and I give the word to Professor Evenel.
Thank you very much, Harry. I'm really pleased to meet you, and I did enjoy reading your thesis. What a huge amount of work was entailed in all of that. Just congratulations. Yeah, I do have some questions for you. I share a lot of the experiences that you write about in your thesis. And I wanted to ask you, one of the things you demonstrate beyond any doubt is that there's a difficulty identifying retractions quickly for the literature wherever they are cited. And I wondered if there are processes that could be put in place that would actually circumvent all the literature searching, which is extremely time consuming, even though AI might start to contribute to that. We have a model in as much as PubPeer has a plugin that automatically alerts people that there is a comment on PubPeer in relation to any article they have in front of them. Could we not have something similar when retractions occurred?
Thank you very much for your kind words, highly esteemed opponent, and for that excellent question. So I do believe that, yes, absolutely, we could have something similar. There is an initiative of RETRACTED that is working towards a very similar sort of model of alerting people, at least of when they've cited retracted publications, so that they are informed of this. My hope would be that that could potentially be extended. The Retraction Watch database is now, it has been acquired by Crossref, it has been made openly available. And so that creates a lot of new opportunities for the creation of plugins, integrations into other systems. And so my hope would be that through that, yes, there would be a functionality in which, regardless of where somebody was accessing the literature, they would be receiving an immediate notification. That is already built into certain platforms, but it is platform specific. So having something a little bit more universal would, I think, really help to raise awareness of the retracted status of publications and help to mitigate some of that impact.
What, in fact, if the Retraction Watch database directly had a plugin that alerted people, which would basically circumvent all of these needs for other things?
I think that would be fantastic. I would say I think the Retraction Watch database, although it is a fantastic source of information and incredibly comprehensive, does need to be continually updated, does need to be, we need to make sure that it is as complete as possible, a representation of all retracted publications. And so there is some ongoing work that needs to happen there. I think potentially the one challenge within that is when we think about the reasons that things are retracted. Retraction Watch doesn't create data, they curate data. So if there is a vague notice, if there's a notice behind a paywall that they're unable to access, they will not be able to pull in that information. And so people wouldn't necessarily get that additional context of why something got retracted. They would simply know that there had been a retraction. Now, that might be sufficient for some purposes, but it may not be sufficient for all purposes, and it may not be ideal. And so I think that would be the one kind of caveat to reliance upon that single data source. But certainly, yes, if it could be leveraged and could be made a little bit more immediate and accessible, I do think that would be a tremendous benefit to the scholarly community.
Thank you. You talk about citations being perpetuated. It may be citations for work that has already been retracted that people haven't identified, or work that has been retracted that people know about. To what extent might those be influenced by self-citation and also citation rings of researchers who are actually involved in problematic research?
That is an excellent and very thought-provoking question. Certainly, yes, there is a potential for that ongoing citation if we were to remove self-citations from those citation counts and potentially see if there was overall changes. I've read some literature that's indicated that that perpetuation is in part due to the fact that people keep building upon their own work, even if that work is fundamentally flawed. And so there is that perpetuation by those specific individuals. But I think there is a larger question there as well, particularly with regards to those citation rings and individuals who maybe are not authors on those original retracted papers, but nevertheless are perhaps involved in some, shall we say, questionable publishing practices and behaviors as well.
Yes, I mean, I don't think it's likely to be a high proportion, but certainly in the recent research we've done, investigating one group that had fabricated 172 trials of the citations, probably about 10% of subsequent citations were from that group. So they were perpetuating, the citations to some extent. You talk about all the people involved in publishing academic literature and their roles to play. I suppose I'm most interested in thinking about funding agencies and how they might intervene, because at the moment they've been fairly silent on all of these issues. Do you have any ideas?
Yes, one thing, and I will say this is not my original idea. I read it in the literature and thought it was an excellent one, was that currently funding agencies don't really take retracted publications into account when they're assessing grant applications for a number of reasons. But if there was a way to essentially incorporate acknowledgement of self-correction within that process and kind of use that as evidence of integrity, that might be a way to incentivize this behavior. And rather than focus on kind of the punitive aspects of misconduct investigations, instead focus on really encouraging people to self-correct and not having it kind of positioned as something that might be detrimental to their ongoing research and funding efforts. And so rather than see funding agencies maybe focus on kind of the punitive components of that, I think it would be really interesting and beneficial to have some conversation around how they could promote more of this citation integrity, research integrity behavior through self-correction.
Do you think funders have a more direct role? After all, they provide the funds to institutions that pay the publishers.
Yes, I mean, certainly there are cases where funding agencies, especially upon discovering that data were fabricated or there was research misconduct, have essentially revoked the funding or asked for compensation for those efforts, which is I would say, very strong deterrent to that behavior. So that is not necessarily commonplace, but I believe there have been a few cases, at least specifically with regards to the NIH, where the outcomes of investigations have led to direct funding impacts on particular projects and researchers.
Yeah, I'm talking more about the publishers. In the UK, the libraries pay the 5 major publishers, £120 million a year for open access. And we all know that they can take a long time to investigate and correct the literature. Is there something funders could do to help support them act more quickly?
So certainly, I think misconduct investigations especially do take time. We want to make sure that people are going through that complete process. I think when we do see, there are certain publishers in certain instances where it seems to be less about the time necessary to complete the investigation and almost more of a reticence to issue retractions, issue formal statements. I think in those cases, that might be something that perhaps libraries and library consortia consider no longer engaging in transformative agreements. If publishers do not meet certain standards, for example, like acting promptly to address issues of research integrity, or I'd venture to say also things like compliance with the NISO communication of retractions, removals, and expressions of concern guidelines. If publishers are not updating their metadata and making this information available, I would think that it would be an appropriate time to consider the extent of the funding that is being offered directly to those publishers in the creation and the dissemination of these publications.
Yes, because I think particularly for the NISO standards, there isn't anything that ensures the publishers will adopt those.
Professor Evenil and Ms. Candidate, we have to continue, so I have to interrupt.
Yes.
We have 3 more opponents to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you that you joined. And I would like to move on to Dr. Schor. She's affiliated with Maastricht University and involved in literature review methodology. And I would also like to give her the word to discuss with you. Dr. Schor, I give you the word.
Thank you, Rector. Dear Ms. Candidate, I would like to start by congratulating you on this very impressive and solid work body of research, which I believe does highlight a very important set of issues in our current research practices. Obviously, I also have a few questions for you, and I would like to start with your proposition 1, if you could maybe read that for us.
Sure. I don't have that up on my screen right at this second, but I will grab that immediately. So my proposition 1 is that it is difficult to know whether a publication has been retracted.
Yes, and for this you refer to both chapters 2 and 6. And I appreciate that the chapters, the findings in chapter 2 do sort of show that it could be difficult to find whether a publication has been retracted. So using the resources used to discover articles. However, if we turn to chapter 6, and especially the data in table 6.2, it does seem that the integration of the retraction watch data into especially Zotero, but also other reference management software does in fact make it very easy to identify the vast majority of retracted articles. So therefore, I would disagree with this proposition. Could you maybe elaborate on this a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for that excellent question, esteemed opponent. Certainly, we did see in chapter 6 that Zotero does do quite a good job of identifying retracted publications. There are a few caveats to that, one of which is that our reference set was based on Retraction Watch data, and Zotero operates using an integration with Retraction Watch. And so given that, one would expect that it would have fairly good coverage of Retraction Watch materials. What is not covered in chapter 6 and what we didn't cover in this thesis was how well it might deal with retracted publications that are not in Retraction Watch, and whether or not that might be an issue. Furthermore, even though Zotero did quite a good job, it didn't capture absolutely everything. There were still publications that, although they were in Retraction Watch, and although Zotero has an integration with Retraction Watch, nevertheless, the publications were not marked as retracted. And so in those cases, if one were to rely solely on Zotero as the identification mechanism, it would be insufficient. because there would be that possibility that that publication or those publications would not be captured. And so even though Zotero is quite good, and certainly it is, if one already uses Zotero, a very streamlined workflow, having said that, it is not perfect. And in those cases where it does miss things, it can be very challenging to know that it has missed things and then what one should do as a result of that.
Thank you. So what percentage of retracted articles do you estimate are not currently covered by Retraction Watch?
Thank you for that excellent question. So it is difficult to say. And I would say, so because Retraction Watch is the most comprehensive source of information, and so we don't have another body that's technically larger to kind of compare it to. So it really is the gold standard. Where it is potentially lacking is that Retraction Watch was launched in 2010, and the Retraction Watch database was launched several years later. So in terms of retractions that might happen to that point in time, we have maybe a little bit less insight into what that might look like. Retraction Watch also doesn't include its language. And so it's difficult to know about its coverage, particularly of non-English language content and what might be missed there.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I would then like to move on to your proposals for mitigating the effects of retractions on evidence synthesis, as are outlined on pages 134 to 136. I have a few questions related to that. First of all, most of these measures are really focused on retractions that, or alleviating the impact of retractions that happen prior to the publication of the evidence synthesis piece of work. However, in chapter 5, you note that 65% of citations occurred before retraction. So it would seem that a lot of these proposals would not mitigate the majority of the actual issue. So would you maybe have suggestions for measures that would help with these sort of pre-retraction citations, and maybe a workflow to limit the impact of those?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for that excellent question. Certainly the impact of materials that are later retracted can be quite significant, and those are, at least in our study, that was the majority of those citations. There are several things that can be done. Part of that is about ensuring awareness of the fact that a retraction has occurred in an item that was cited in a previously published evidence synthesis. And so certain technologies like RetractoBot, for example, can help to address that. But then there is also the question of what does one do with that information? If it is that you are alerted to the fact that your evidence synthesis has cited a retracted publication or an item that has now been retracted, what steps might one take? And so typically what I would advocate for would be that one should be conducting essentially a sensitivity analysis, trying to leave out those problematic or retracted studies and seeing what the impact of that might be. If there is impact, publishing a correction, or if there is no impact, making a statement, perhaps a journal or a letter to the editor to indicate why a correction is not necessary. And certainly there have been cases, I can think, for example, of a meta-analysis of ivermectin in the treatment of COVID-19. And that was published, and then later 2 of the included studies were found to be retracted. And so those authors, that journal, published a correction, because once those particular studies were removed, the findings regarding decreased mortality were invalidated. And so it was important to address that in the literature. And so I think treating this as an opportunity to update and correct those materials that need to be corrected, but also be transparent as to why something perhaps didn't change or doesn't need to be corrected is really important.
And who should take responsibility for making these amendments?
I would say that the original authors should take responsibility, as they are the authors and the creators of the work. So I wouldn't think that, for example, an editor or journal would take the initiative on behalf of the authors to reanalyze their data. If the original authors are perhaps unable to create that amendment, there may also be additional publications or additional research teams that perhaps would want to do an updated evidence synthesis that would account for some of those studies that had since been dated.
So you don't feel it should also be a responsibility of the journal or the editor to ensure that these authors take action, or at least flag if no action has been taken but probably should have been taken?
Oh, no, I absolutely do believe that the journals have a role to play in terms of indicating where there might be an issue. However, I wouldn't say that the journals have a role to play in reanalyzing the original data. So if the journal, for example, was to become aware of the fact that an evidence synthesis had cited a publication that had since been retracted, and the authors were aware of this, the authors perhaps refuse to take action on that, it may be that the editors decide to issue an expression of concern, for example, to indicate that there was an issue there, but that further action had not been taken at this time.
Okay. Do I have time for a follow-on question, or should we be moving on?
Basically, if you have a short question, yes. If it's a long question, no.
Okay. In that case, I would like to ask very briefly, you highlighted that the issue of ongoing citations is most prevalent in poor quality reviews, and there's still a shocking amount of poor quality reviews, whilst there's been very good guidelines available. So how do we ensure that your recommendations are actually going to be effective in the future?
Thank you for that excellent question. Certainly that does seem to be an ongoing problem, highlighted both by this thesis, but also there are a number of studies that look at the overall quality of evidence syntheses, and many do find that there are some significant issues. I do hope that with the increased guidance and hopefully the ongoing adoption of this increased guidance by journals, and then ensuring that there are peer reviewers with an appropriate breadth of expertise, for example, including librarians and information professionals as peer reviewers, there may be some opportunity to mitigate some of that impact or how to at least further that conversation. But there definitely is an ongoing issue, I would say, outside of the citation of retracted publications with the overall quality of evidence syntheses that are published.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the answer. Very good. And thank you also, Dr. Schor. And we have to move on to the next opponent, which will be Emeritus Professor Kleinen. He is Emeritus Professor in Systematic Reviews in Healthcare, and he's affiliated with the Kleinen Systematic Reviews Ltd. And as far as I can see, that's organized in the UK. And I'd like to give him the word, Professor Kleinen.
Thank you very much, Rector, dear candidate, dear Ms. Bakker. My congratulations to a tremendous amount of work. I think your thesis is really a very nice way to draw attention to this very important topic, which has been underrated and undervalued so far, in my opinion, especially having done a lot of systematic reviews myself. Retractions barely came up as an issue or even as a thought when doing systematic reviews. So thank you very much for that. It also triggered me to look into a retracted article by myself and a number of co-authors, which was a long time ago, but it leads to my first question. And the reason for retraction was actually not anything to do with the authors, but it was actually the editor of a highly ranked journal who took it on himself to single-handedly change the conclusions of the paper after acceptance of the paper and before publication of the paper. And when we saw the publication, we couldn't believe our eyes as authors. So actually, we as authors immediately told them that this should be retracted. And we actually then sent the paper to a different journal, even a higher ranking journal, and it has now been cited over 250 times. But that leads me to your definitions of retraction, like in on page 18, the COPE guidelines and other guidelines that you cite and use in your thesis. Because I feel they are actually not comprehensive. There is much more going on around retraction than the reasons that are being quoted there. So I wonder what impact that might have on basically all your chapters, if the criteria that you've been using are actually not comprehensive and are missing out on important occasions where retractions take place.
Thank you very much for your kind words, highly esteemed opponent, and for your excellent question. Certainly the COPE definition is, one might say, relatively narrow, in that it really does focus in on those cases of misconduct, of error, plagiarism, some pretty significant challenges. What we see actually in practice is that oftentimes this, you can say, concept of administrative error, other types of error, does come into play when we look at how things are actually retracted or why they're actually retracted. So there is, one might argue, a slight disconnect in terms of the reasons that COPE says that things should be retracted, and then how things are, or why things are actually retracted in practice. For example, I have seen publications that get retracted because the article processing charge doesn't get paid. And so it's actually nothing to do with the substance of the paper or the quality of the research. It is retracted because that specific journal considers that to be a breach of editorial policy. And so one of the challenges that we do have is that we have these COPE guidelines, but then each publisher and sometimes journals within the publishers will have their own set of guidelines for what constitutes a retraction or what warrants a retraction. With the data set that we were drawing on, the Retraction Watch database, it's not necessarily applying the COPE guidelines or applying the individual journal policies. It's simply looking at what was retracted and then categorizing those reasons for retraction, as opposed to engaging in any sort of screening process to kind of create a subset of things that were retracted, for example. So I completely agree that there is this, as I said, disconnect between kind of what COPE says things should be retracted for, and then sometimes in practice what we do see things being retracted for. That's not necessarily manifest in the Retraction Watch data that we were building on, but I think it is also a very interesting area for discussion and consideration. Is this section of publications that maybe are being retracted for reasons other than what COPE would tell us things should be retracted for?
Okay, thank you. But yeah, my example, I would not count as an administrative error or what have you. It actually is misconduct by another party that doesn't get mentioned at all. There are journal editors who have misconduct themselves. And that leads me to my next question concerning retraction notices. So in my example, the retraction notice says that there was a disagreement between the editorial group and the authors about some aspects of the paper, and that this will be resolved and the paper will be published at a later stage. So in this case, the retraction notice, it also says that the editors retracted the paper. So the retraction notice is actually a lie. Yeah, and if you consider that also in other cases of retraction notices, the parties that may be involved, it's the journals, it's the authors, it may be the institutions, it may be the funders, it may be even the public and reviewers, it may be the press. The stakes can be very high. Legal arguments may come up, may be threatened as well. So can we actually believe retraction notices at all? I would suggest we should just completely ignore them because they are highly unlikely to actually ever give the full truth.
Thank you for that excellent question. I certainly do agree that retraction notices, at least as we currently have them and see them, oftentimes are completely unhelpful. There is this somewhat idealized version, maybe aspirational version of a retraction notice that is an objective, factual statement of all of the details, including who agreed, who disagreed, who initiated, when things were initiated. As we found in our research, those standards are very rarely met. Oftentimes, things are so vague as to be unhelpful, or in your case, even when it's there, it may not be an accurate representation of the true state of the situation. But rather than saying that we should just ignore retraction notices entirely, I'd really like to advocate for better retraction notices, because I think it can be incredibly helpful for researchers to know why something got retracted, what should they believe about it, what should they not. In a case such as yours, a very vague retraction notice is probably not going to be particularly helpful for an end user, or the retraction notice that was there is probably not helpful for an end user to understand what really happened, how they should build upon that knowledge if they'd already read the article, what they should do with that knowledge that they'd already integrated. So rather than ignoring them, I would argue instead for reform and for greater transparency in the notices themselves. And there are certainly some journals that will, for example, advocate, especially in the case of self-correction, to have the authors of the original article, if they are initiating the retraction, also author the retraction notice, so that it is indicative of their rationale for retraction.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll move on to my next question, which is about your advice to systematic reviewers, which I obviously take at heart personally very much. And that is that we need to be more aware and try and identify those retracted articles. Luckily, in our reviews, we always use endnotes. So hopefully that covers us to some extent. But apart from that, you do cite some papers that show that retracted papers may have an impact on the findings of a systematic review, but there are plenty of papers who also do not really find any impact. So, how important is it actually a problem? And couldn't we actually, as systematic reviewers, have a much better contribution to make in terms of not catching the 1 in 500 that get retracted, but the 1 in 50 that should have been retracted? So an example from 1997 of Martin Traumer, an anesthetist, he did a systematic review and found 3 publications that had no overlap at all between the authors, but actually reported exactly the same study. Clearly an example where the systematic review identified an issue and could instigate necessary retraction of at least 2 of those papers. So can you say a little bit more about the function, about the job that a systematic reviewer can play actually in identifying articles that should have been retracted but haven't been retracted yet?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for that excellent question. Certainly, the number of articles that should be retracted but are not is significantly higher than the number of articles that actually are retracted. And there are one initiative that I'm really intrigued by and kind of following as closely as I can is Inspect SR, which is essentially a trustworthy assessment or a trustworthiness assessment tool. And so it's attempting to, I believe it is either 72 or 76 checks for the quality and to identify problematic studies overall. And so its intention is to for systematic reviewers, for those doing evidence syntheses, to have a tool that can help them identify when a study is problematic, regardless of whether or not it's been retracted. Personally, I would still like to see some of these retraction identification behaviors in place, because if a publication has been retracted due to fraud and misconduct, one doesn't necessarily need to go through the process of appraising it to determine whether or not it's trustworthy, because presumably that process has already been undertaken. And so I would think of it as kind of a twofold approach where we see what is retracted and why it is retracted and potentially exclude things based on that. And then also do this additional assessment of the trustworthiness to identify those potentially problematic studies.
Thank you very much for your answer. And I think we have to proceed. And we proceed till the last opponent, which will be Professor Zijlstra. Professor Zijlstra is Emeritus Professor of Work and Organizational Psychology at our university. And I also like to give him the opportunity to discuss with you. And he's sitting here beside of me. And I move the screen a little bit to him.
Thank you. Dear candidate, it was a pleasure reading your thesis. And actually, I must say, as an author and also as an editor, I was fascinated by the topic. It is an important topic, I now understand. I mean, before I hadn't thought about it so much, but it is indeed important. But I also wonder whether the topic is also not discipline specific. I myself, I'm from the social sciences. I have not been aware of retractions, well, only in a few cases. But I have the impression that the disciplines that you report are healthcare or healthcare related, dentistry, pharmacology, etc., where the commercial interests are quite high. And that may probably also be a kind of a bias in that field. So actually, I'm wondering about the generalizability of your findings. What would you say?
Thank you very much for that excellent question, a highly esteemed opponent. Certainly, this thesis does focus on the health sciences specifically. There are some chapters, for example, with the identification where there isn't that limitation. However, yes, citation behaviors and retraction patterns do differ across different disciplines. They do tend to be highest in specifically engineering and then significantly less common in arts and humanities. With regards to the social sciences, there are some notable cases of retraction, certainly of misconduct. And so I don't think the topic itself is necessarily not applicable. I believe the topic is very applicable. In terms of the specific findings, I would say that I think that these need to be replicated. Some colleagues and I have done some research looking at the field of mental health, which we were defining quite broadly as counseling, psychology, psychiatry, looking across both the health sciences and the sciences. And we did find some fairly similar findings to what we did here in terms of at least the amount of records that are marked. In that case, it was about 40% of the records were actually identified as being retracted. So a similar problem does exist, at least in some health sciences disciplines. But I would be very interested in the future to looking at how these things might manifest, say, in education, in social work, and some of these other social science disciplines that obviously are different from the health sciences, but nevertheless still need to have their corrective mechanisms to address these cases.
Yeah, I agree. I'm aware of, excuse me, I'm aware of the fact that there are in social sciences some high-profile cases of misconduct and papers that have been retracted. But yeah, my point is actually whether the prevalence of retractions in the social sciences or arts and humanities is much lower, and that's just what you just said. Well, the publication landscape has changed considerably over the last, say, 20, 30 years. With a lot of more open access and maybe also more commercial publishers. So do you think that has an effect on retraction or not reporting retraction?
To an extent, I would say yes, I think it does, in that the sheer volume of materials that are being produced and this sort of the publish or perish mentality significantly has grown over time. And so there is potentially this ongoing pressure to kind of keep producing articles, keep producing more and more articles. And then, of course, there are more and more venues in which these articles are being produced, sometimes of variable quality. There is also the pressure on peer reviewers that comes into play with that. More articles require more peer reviewers, more of a time commitment. And so there is kind of this exponential growth within publishing, but there is not an exponential growth of time of the people who are actually doing the work. And so I think there is a question overall of what are those, I don't necessarily want to use terms like gatekeeping, but what are those quality measures that are in place to ensure that the research is really rigorous? And part of that is also not only the volume of publishers, but also the incentive systems that are in place. And why is it that this exponential growth and kind of constantly needing to publish more and publish faster is considered kind of the necessity or kind of considered the norm for scientific productivity. So certainly I think the publishers and the volume of publishers pose some challenges, but I think it kind of speaks to a larger issue around what is considered to be productive, valuable research.
Yeah, which brings me at the next point, the quality of the review of the paper. But also, I mean, you just brought up the topic of that good quality journals have, well, probably a better system in place. In that sense that, well, more retractions are detected and less retracted papers are being cited. So, but what is your definition of a good quality journal compared to moderate or low quality? Is this, well, where is the crucial element? Is it the review process? Is it the editorial team, or is it whatever?
Thank you for that excellent question. I would say it's a number of different factors. Certainly, high quality peer review is absolutely key if we're thinking about a peer-reviewed journal. I would also think that the editorial board, the publisher's stable, all of these are questions that I might consider when I was looking at a journal and trying to assess the quality of it. I don't necessarily think that there is, I'm not a big believer in things like the journal impact factor being indicative of a journal's quality.
Oh dear.
I prefer a much more holistic approach in which we consider kind of the full scope of what is this journal publishing, how are they publishing it, how are they vetting the materials that they publish, all as being markers of quality, as opposed to just what is their acceptance rate. I don't necessarily like those quantitative measures for journal quality.
Yeah, I would agree with that, but it also brings me up to the topic of the whole retraction process, of the process leading up to retraction. Basically, it starts with who initiates this. I mean, who starts proposing that the paper should be retracted? The authors themselves could be, of course, but are there also other partners or parties involved?
Yes, absolutely. There are a number of different individuals or groups that might initiate a retraction. It may be that, for example, a reader reaches out to an editor, to a member of the journal, and flags that there is a particular issue. It could be that an author of another paper. Increasingly, we're also seeing platforms like PubPeer being a source of information, of concerns being raised about the quality of publications. I believe the latest statistic I read on that was that I think it's about 70% of PubPeer comments are either due to or in response to fabrication, falsification, or journal or publisher misconduct. And so again, a really valuable source of information, not necessarily to initiate a retraction, but to raise a concern that might then subsequently lead to a retraction. So I think any number of actors might potentially raise a concern or might kind of initiate the process of the retraction.
Yeah, well, basically, what I'm hearing and listening to your answers and reading your chapter, I mean, it's quite a difficult process and a lot of parties involved. Wouldn't you say that it does call for a kind of an oversight authority in this discipline, this field? Because there are commercial interests, publishers have commercial interests, review boards, ethical boards, editorial boards, etc. So more and more a kind of an independent party authority that oversees this process.
That is a very interesting idea, highly esteemed opponent. As of yet, that's not something I've fully grappled with. Part of, I think one of the major challenges of this issue is that we do have so many different parties and they don't always communicate with each other. We might have institutional investigations and the institutions are not communicating with the journals or vice versa. And so there is potentially a breakdown in information. And there are also sometimes in terms of just standards of, are things being retracted when they should be retracted? Are the notices complete? An oversight body is certainly an interesting idea. My hope would be that through kind of greater standardization, more guidance, and then also just encouragement amongst the different actors that this would be adopted, but perhaps if that is not the case.
Very well. As you noticed, thank you, Beadle, to be on time. Miss Candidate, Miss Bakker, the time appointed for your thesis has now officially passed. The degree committee will not withdraw. We will move to another room to discuss the quality of your thesis, but also to discuss the way you have defended your thesis and we also will discuss your presentation. And I request that you wait till you will be beamed, or will you transferred again to this room, and that we get back and will explain to you the results of our deliberation and our return. Thank you very much. Yes, it's there. Good. Dear Miss Candidate, dear Miss Kathleen Baker, the degree committee here present, normally I should be now in focus. Technical team, I think you should put me now in the screen. We continue anyway. Yeah, okay. And I start over again. The degree committee here present, online, has assessed not so much the quality of your thesis, that was already approved, but we have looked particularly to your presentation and of course to your defense this morning. And in view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you officially the degree of doctor. Professor Segers, your first promoter, is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university customs, and therefore I invite your supervisor now to take the floor, and I give the word to Professor Segers.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I do.
Then, by the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present online, I hereby confer upon you, Caitlin Bakker, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, you will soon receive the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the supervisor affixed with the official seal of the university now shown by the below.
All right. Yeah.
Dear Caitlin, it is my great pleasure and honor to offer you this laudatio on behalf of the supervisory team. Today marks an important milestone not only in your academic journal, but also in the ongoing collaboration with Maastricht University and the British Medical Journal as part of your PhD program on evidence-based publishing. Caitlin is now our second PhD graduate of this program, what was an outstanding representation of what the program is about. Your thesis, the representation, identification, and impact of retracted publications in biomedical literature tackles a deep relevance to the integrity of the scientific communication. Retractions are not only editorial corrections, but they shape the credibility of research. Because of that, your work has been of utmost importance. Your work not only identifies the shortcomings in the current systems, but also recognize what we should do dealing with retracted research. And you also offer guidance to us how we as a community can do this better. This is important work, and it comes from someone who we think is already an established scientist and thought leader in this field. As the director of open research and publishing at the University of Minnesota Libraries, you're leading the effort in scholarly communication. I think other libraries should be jealous, and I confirm that you already got an invitation from Maastricht University Library to speak about this topic in the future. And we should have an honor to host you at Maastricht University again. You're not only shaping the field in your own institution, but you make an impact internationally, and I think that's great to see. Working with you, Caitlin, was a delight. As we could have seen today, you're exceptionally organized, dedicated, and you were always prepared. During our meetings, I think we had the opportunity to learn from some things ourselves, including today during the presentation and defense of your PhD thesis. We, Lex, Sarah, and I can say that we learned a great deal from you, and we hope that you might have picked up a few things from ourselves as well. Supervising you was a privilege. And of course, Bakker is a Dutch surname, and fittingly, this PhD has been awarded here in the Netherlands. In fact, you have family roots in Zeist, a town not that far from here. So I think we would like to add this as a nice poetic touch to the story, almost as if your academic journey came full circle back to the Netherlands. So we sincerely hope that this is not the ending, but rather the beginning of our collaboration with you, the supervisory team, and the BMJ. And we offer you our heartfelt congratulations today. Gefeliciteerd, Dr. Bakker.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. You can unmute if you want, so then everybody, so she can hear the clapping. Very good. Dear Dr. Bakker, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I would like to congratulate you with this academic distinction. For our country in the Netherlands, it's our highest academic distinction which you can gain, and you deserved it well. You defended in the most appropriate way. And as a rector, as a pro-rector, I'm not a rector, as a pro-rector, I would say, I got the impression a little bit that you liked it to defend, that you really enjoyed it. You didn't seem to me nervous. I don't know, because it's online. If you do it on site, you can really see and smell actually the candidate, but you enjoyed it and you did quite well. And I would, unfortunately, I cannot congratulate you personally, but in my congratulations, I also would like to include your promotion team who guided you over the years. And I was also interested, and I tried to get some information from your booklet. How do you actually decided to go on this topic, to go in this field, and to really make a PhD thesis together? But that's something which would be nice to discuss when you would be here, but you're not here, so we're not going to discuss this any further. I also would like to thank the members of the Corona who joined us, these 4 members. I always say to my members of the Corona, you just have in this case 11 minutes, but it takes more than 11 minutes to prepare and to read all the questions, and I would like to thank them for them. And by saying this, I would say, have a beautiful day wherever you are. I think I understand now you are in Minnesota. Yes?
Saskatchewan at the moment.
In Saskatchewan. Okay, that's okay. I would say enjoy. I hope you have a party tonight with your friends and family over there who maybe have joined online. You did a great job, and I wish you a very nice day. And I wish everybody here a good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. I think we also have made a picture. I think the technical team make a picture that we will send to you, to you, so you have a nice remembrance of this day. And by this, I declare this ceremony officially ended. Thank you very much. Okay, the recording has stopped. So if anybody would like to say a personal word to the new young doctor, open now for everybody. Okay?
Yes, can I start?
Of course.
So tell us what you're going to be doing next in this area.
There's a couple of topics that I'm really